Bulavanakana, good morning, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, members of the Diplomatic Corps, development partners, private stakeholders, NGOs. I have some statistics here and figures, but I'd like to speak off the cuff in respect of this particular project that's being launched. But firstly, I'd also like us to remember, and just to bring home the point, the fact that we've just had recently a major cyclone in Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe, where approximately 1.7 million people have been affected. I understand half of them are actually children. Now, this will, of course, create a lot of dislocation. People will be in temporary shelters. Some people may not be, in fact, be able to go back to the homes where they lived, or indeed the lands in which they lived. The reality is that we have a global phenomena, which is called climate change. And as a result of that, apart from all the talk that we may have in international forums, the reality is that it does impact people in a very tangible and direct and practical manner. And we have to be able to deal with these issues head on. We have to be able to understand that it does, in fact, create an existential threat also to many countries, many societies, many ways of living that people have lived for generations. In respect of the effects of climate change, specific to what we are discussing this morning, you have two types of migration, if you like. One is, of course, your IDPs, or internally displaced persons, as a result of climate change. We've, of course, seen that. We have already moved at least 3 villages to different locations. The most common or well-known one is being Vunidongaloa, up in the north of this country. We had to move our entire village to higher ground. Now, these people have lived or had lived in their village for generations. There's a particular way of life, a particular attachment to the land, there's ancestral heritage there, there's a sustained way of living their lives, but now being moved to higher ground, of course, poses different issues, different challenges. So it is not necessarily a simple issue of just relocating somebody to higher ground. You have to address the entire relocation in a holistic manner. Apart from the psychological impact of it, you have to look at the socio-economic impact of it, and indeed whether that relocation can be sustained. The second issue, of course, is the fact that you have now migration, forced migration, as a result of climate change, as a result of rising seas, in particular in the Pacific. As we had discussions earlier on, there are 3 types. People may, because of lack of economic opportunities, want to migrate because a particular way of livelihood has been affected, so they may need to go overseas. Then there may be some people who actually would need to move because of the fact that their land is no longer available, or the fact that they have been forced as a result of that land being no longer available. There's a lot of talk about Tuvalu and Kiribati being affected. In fact, Fiji was one of the first countries, through our Honorable Prime Minister, where we have said, because we are all one, we are part of the Pacific, that they are welcome to come to Fiji in the event that the islands actually submerge beneath the waters. Now, the reality, of course, is not that easy. The reality is that it does pose a number of legal issues. It does pose a number of socioeconomic issues. And there needs to be, a concerted effort in building some, one may say, colloquially speaking, rules around this. And this is why this workshop, I think, is very, very important, because there are a number of issues that come into play. So rules pertaining to the status of these people, in respect of, for example, if you consider them to be refugees, then how do you process that? What are the rules around that? If you consider them to be under rules of forced migration, how will your domestic laws actually apply to them? Will they immediately, for example, get work permit status? Will they be able to access the services that all the other citizens of that country actually have access to? So all these issues need to be looked at. Of course, on the back end, what I call the back end, you also have issues pertaining to, if, for example, how do you now measure your EEZ? If you have a chain of islands, you generally have your 200-mile zone, and the furthest point away. So if that furthest point away is now underwater, where do you measure EEZ from? The other issue, of course, is that if a particular country is completely submerged underwater, does that country still exist? A former Prime Minister of Australia recently made headlines by saying that we'll give you citizenship if you give us control over territorial waters. So, it kind of relates to a book that I'm reading at the moment. It's saying, can the markets offer everything to you? And not everything should be up for sale. So I think, it is critically, therefore, important for us to be able to understand the impact of it. And this is one area that not much discussion has taken place. We have started, one may call it in a fairly rudimentary manner in the AG's office, to try and eke out these issues. There are no real solutions per se at the moment, but we need to be able to develop solutions. We need to be able to have some rules around this, so there's a general understanding, not just within the region, but hopefully globally. If you look at a country like Bangladesh, they say with the current sea level rises, 17%, they lose 17% of their landmass because they've got so much flatlands. Now, given the population of Bangladesh, you're probably looking at hundreds or tens of millions of people they'll be affected. Will that mean that they'll push across the border to India or push across the border to the other side into Burma? Although I think that's not a big possibility at the moment. What are the implications of this? So I think this is very critically important for us, and I do not necessarily want to make a long speech, but I'm glad that all the key UN agencies are involved in this, IOM and ILO, in UNESCO, because we need to be able to, as I said, develop some very good thinking around it, some very good solutions around it. And if we are able to come up with a particular, set of a regime around it, then it becomes a lot easier to implement. As was said in the introduction, the reality is that in particular in the Pacific, and at least that's what Fiji has been advocating, now when we actually talk about development finance, we must also talk about climate finance. We had Cyclone Winston in 2016 that within a span of about 48 hours wiped off 1/3 of the value of our GDP, approximately 1.2 to 1.3 billion US dollars. That's very substantial. We're still paying for the cost of that. We're still rebuilding. And of course, to just drive home the point, last year we had 3 cyclones in 1 year. Maybe not as intensive and destructive as Winston. Nonetheless, it does put a strain on your budget. So it is within that context that we need to be able to, for example, discuss migration, internally displaced persons, because the reality is, as we've said, climate change also has an enormous impact, and I think the UN agencies are beginning to also appreciate this. We talk about SDGs. Your ability to achieve the stated objectives of SDG becomes a lot more limited if you do not have access to finance. Will you be able to, for example, have full tertiary medical care if you are being, year in, year out, or every 2 years being ravaged by, single events that cause destructive, have enormous destruction to your economy? So your ability to bounce back is limited, but your ability to be able to meet the SDG goals is in fact extremely limited, because that requires additional resources. So I think, within this context, we simply cannot isolate these matters. We need to be able to take a holistic approach, understand the dynamics of economics, understand the dynamics of access to finance, understand the dynamics to concessional funding. All of that comes hand in hand with this, because your ability to respond to this phenomena of forced migration or dislocation within your own country will not necessarily be fulfilled, or you won't be able to achieve that fully if you do not have access to funds. And that's very important. And we are hoping, Fiji this year has been given the privilege and indeed the honor of being the chair of World Bank and IMF simultaneously, whilst also being the chair of the Small States Forum at the World Bank level. So we want to be able to, use what we say, the dynamics that exist in Washington and interlace it with the dynamics that's going to exist in New York this year with the climate summit that's being led by the Secretary General, and how we can develop synergies, because they cannot actually be dealt in isolation. So it's very critical for us to understand that. I'd like to once again thank the organizers for this gathering, and I hope I provided some food for thought. I don't like the idea of giving very long speeches, but hopefully, in particular with these types of openings, you can eke out. You are the experts. As has been said, we have mainstreamed climate change by positioning it. We took a strategic decision to create a climate change division within the Ministry of Economy, because the Ministry of Economy used to be called Ministry of Finance and Planning. And of course, that is a very kind of limited scope, if you like. By having it within the Ministry of Economy, we know that we'll be able to mainstream it, whether it's through agriculture, whether it's through housing and community development, whether it's to do with environment, or any other aspect of governance, because the reality is we do actually have to do it. Otherwise, we'll get left behind. Thank you once again to the organizers, and I wish you a very good workshop. Binaka. Thank you.